The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning humming above the judge's bench. My younger brother, Richard, leaned back in his chair and smiled like a man who had already won. "Enjoy retirement," he said. A few people in the gallery glanced toward me. Then he added the part he clearly enjoyed most without a house. The smile on his face wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was satisfaction. The kind that comes from believing you've finally beaten someone you've been competing against your entire life. I looked at him for a moment. Then I smiled. "But you forgot one thing." Richard's attorney suddenly looked up from his paperwork. "What did you just say?" I folded my hands calmly in front of me because the document Richard had forced me to sign wasn't what he thought it was, and neither was the inheritance he had spent the last 8 months bragging about, but to explain that I need to go back to the week my father died. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 67 years old. I retired from the United States Navy after 26 years of service. Most of my adult life was spent aboard ships at military bases and in offices where every detail mattered. I learned discipline, patience, and perhaps most importantly, I learned not to panic when everyone around me was losing their minds. Those lessons would end up saving me, though at the time I didn't know it. My father, Walter Carter, died on a rainy Thursday morning in Norfolk, Virginia. The call came just after sunrise. I was drinking coffee in my small townhouse outside Richmond when my phone rang. The number belonged to Richard. I knew before answering. Nobody calls that early with good news. "Dad passed away this morning," Richard said. His voice sounded strange. Not sad, not emotional, just flat. The way someone sounds when they're reporting information. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. No matter how complicated a relationship may be, losing a parent changes something inside you, even when you expect it, even when you've spent years preparing for it. My father and I had never been especially close. Walter Carter was a proud man, a hard man, the kind of man who believed affection made people weak. Growing up, I spent years trying to earn his approval. Straight A's, sports, scholarships, military service, nothing seemed to matter. Whatever I achieved, it was never enough. Richard figured that out much earlier than I did. Instead of chasing approval, he learned how to stay close to it. He stayed in Norfolk, worked nearby, visited often, had dinner with Dad every Sunday. Meanwhile, I was stationed all over the world. The distance between my father and me became more than geography. It became habit. The funeral took place 4 days later. The church was packed. Old neighbors, former co-workers, veterans, family, friends, people who had known my father for decades. I sat in the second row wearing a simple black dress. Many people approached me afterward. Several remembered my military career. Others remembered my mother. My mother had been the warm one, the gentle one. She'd passed away nearly 20 years earlier. Sometimes, I think the family began falling apart the day we buried her. At the reception, something felt off. Richard moved through the crowd like a politician working a room, shaking hands, accepting condolences, telling stories, making plans. Several times I overheard him saying the same thing. "Everything's already handled," or "Dad made sure all the paperwork was taken care of." The comments seemed strange. The funeral had barely ended. Most families were still grieving at that point. Richard already sounded like a man discussing business. I noticed other people noticing it too, but nobody said anything. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing alone near the church parking lot. A light rain had started falling. Richard walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed me one. "For old time's sake," he said. We stood there quietly watching people leave. Then he spoke. "Dad simplified everything before he died." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "Just means probate shouldn't be complicated." There was something rehearsed about the answer, like he'd practiced saying it. I remember feeling a small knot forming in my stomach. Not fear, just uncertainty. A week later, Richard invited me to meet with his attorney. The lawyer's name was Stephen Granger. His office sat in an older brick building downtown. Nothing fancy. The meeting seemed routine, at least at first. Stephen explained that Dad had organized various estate documents before his death. Several forms required signatures from both heirs. According to him, it would help avoid delays. I asked questions. Some not enough. That's a mistake I'll always own. Grief makes people vulnerable. Even disciplined people. Especially disciplined people. You're tired, distracted, emotionally exhausted. You want difficult things finished, not prolonged. The stack of papers was thick. page after page, legal language, property descriptions, trust references, transfer agreements. Most of it sounded routine. Richard sat quietly beside me, occasionally nodding, occasionally reassuring me. It's just standard stuff. Looking back, that's the part that bothers me most. Not the deception, the trust. I trusted my brother. Maybe not completely, but enough. And that's all he needed. I signed every page, every signature line, every required initial. Then I drove back home believing everything had been handled properly. For a while, life returned to normal. I worked in my garden, volunteered occasionally at a veterans center, spent time with friends. Months passed. Then one afternoon, an official letter arrived. I opened it at my kitchen table. By the time I finished reading, I felt something cold settle into my chest. According to the estate records, Richard now owned nearly everything: the family house, the lake property, the investment accounts, the rental properties, virtually the entire estate. My inheritance was gone, legally transferred with my signature attached. I called Richard immediately. He answered on the second ring, almost like he'd been expecting it. "You finally got the paperwork?" he asked. I stared out my kitchen window. "You tricked me." There was a pause, then a sigh. "No, Evelyn. You signed willingly. You knew what you were signing. We both know that's not true." Another pause. Then his voice hardened. "Dad wanted me handling things." The statement landed harder than I expected. Not because I believed it, because I had spent my entire childhood hearing versions of it. Richard was trusted. Richard was dependable. Richard stayed. Richard mattered. That night, I barely slept. Anger came and went in waves. So did embarrassment. At 67 years old, after decades in the Navy, I'd been outmaneuvered by my own brother. At least that's what I believed. The next morning, several friends urged me to hire a lawyer immediately. Some wanted me to sue. Others wanted me to go public. I listened, then declined. Not because I accepted defeat, because something felt wrong. The situation seemed too neat, too perfect. Real life rarely works that way. Years in military service had taught me something important. When the picture looks too clean, you're probably missing part of it. So instead of reacting, I requested copies of every document I had signed, every page, every attachment, every exhibit. The package arrived 2 weeks later. I spread the papers across my dining room table. For hours, I read slowly, carefully, line by line. Near midnight, I reached a section buried deep within one transfer agreement. A paragraph most people would skip. A paragraph Richard clearly never expected me to notice. I stopped reading. Then I read it again, and this time I smiled. I sat at my dining room table until nearly 0 inches the morning. The house was completely silent, except for the ticking of an old wall clock my mother had bought sometime in the 1980s. The transfer agreement lay open beneath a reading lamp. Most people would have missed the paragraph. Truthfully, I almost missed it myself. The clause was buried in dense legal language. Halfway through a section referencing an old family trust, one sentence caught my attention, then another, then another. The wording wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing warning signs, no giant legal trap hiding in plain sight. Just a simple statement indicating that any beneficiary receiving transferred assets would also assume all obligations, liabilities, guarantees, encumbrances, and financial responsibilities attached to those assets. I leaned back slowly. Something about that language felt familiar. Very familiar. For several minutes, I stared at the ceiling. Then I suddenly remembered a conversation from nearly 12 years earlier. My father had invited me to lunch during one of my visits home. We'd met at a seafood restaurant near the waterfront. It wasn't a particularly pleasant lunch. Most conversations with Walter Carter weren't. But near the end of the meal, he'd complained about money. That alone had surprised me. My father rarely admitted weakness, especially financial weakness. He'd mentioned a failed business investment, something involving commercial property development. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. The details seemed boring. What I remembered now was his frustration and one specific phrase. I had to put everything up as collateral. Everything. The memory kept bothering me. The next morning, I pulled out an old notebook where I occasionally wrote down family information. There it was, a short entry from 12 years ago. Dad upset. Commercial property loan. Lake property collateral. Possible refinancing. Nothing else. just those few notes. But they were enough to make me curious. And curiosity has always been dangerous for people who prefer comfortable lies. Over the next several weeks, I began investigating. Not obsessively, methodically, the same way I'd approached military audits for years. One document at a time, one fact at a time. No assumptions, no emotional conclusions, just evidence. I visited the county records office, spoke with clerks, requested filings, reviewed public records. Most employees were friendly once they realized I wasn't looking for gossip. I was looking for paperwork. Paperwork tells the truth when people won't. The deeper I dug, the stranger things became. My father had indeed secured multiple loans over the years. Some were normal, others were not. Several appeared connected to business ventures that had quietly failed. Properties had been pledged as collateral. Assets had been leveraged. Guarantees had been signed. Some obligations had been refinanced repeatedly rather than fully paid. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they certainly weren't insignificant, and they definitely weren't reflected in Richard's celebration. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to be enjoying life. Mutual friends occasionally mentioned seeing him around town. He had started driving a new luxury SUV. He was talking about renovating the lake house. One acquaintance told me Richard had described himself as the sole caretaker of the family legacy. That phrase actually made me laugh, not because it was funny, because it sounded exactly like something my father would have said. One afternoon, my longtime friend Martha stopped by with a casserole. People my age still bring casseroles when life gets complicated. It's one of the things I love about our generation. Martha sat at my kitchen table while I organized paperwork. She watched me sorting folders. "You're not suing him?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She frowned. "Evelyn, he stole your inheritance." I smiled. "Maybe. What does that mean?" "It means I don't have all the facts yet." Martha looked at the mountain of documents. "Looks like enough facts to me. Not even close." At military service teaches patience. Television dramas make people believe justice arrives quickly. Real life rarely works that way. Real life moves through records, offices, bank statements, property filings, tax documents, boring details. Most major mistakes happen because people stop paying attention to boring details. Richard's mistake, I suspected, lived somewhere inside those details. I just hadn't found it yet. Then I found something interesting. A name, an accounting firm my father had used years earlier. The firm no longer existed, but after several phone calls, I located a retired accountant named Charles Benson. He agreed to meet me for coffee. Charles was 78 years old, sharp as a razor. The moment I mentioned Walter Carter, he sighed. "There's a name I haven't heard in years." I showed him several public documents. He adjusted his glasses and studied them carefully. After a few minutes, he nodded. I wondered when this would eventually surface. My heart sped up slightly. "What exactly is this?" Charles tapped one page. "Your father spent years restructuring debt." "How much debt?" He hesitated. "Enough to keep him awake at night." Charles couldn't disclose confidential information. Professional ethics still mattered to him, but he could discuss publicly available records, and he did. What emerged was a picture I'd never fully understood. My father had been wealthy, at least outwardly, but much of that wealth had become increasingly complicated. Some assets carried obligations, others carried guarantees. Several properties existed within financial arrangements that required careful management. The estate wasn't a treasure chest. It was more like a complicated machine. One wrong move could trigger consequences. As I drove home, I kept replaying the conversation. Something finally clicked. Richard hadn't actually examined what he'd inherited. He'd only looked at what he believed he inherited. Those are very different things. One is reality, the other is assumption. And assumption is expensive. A few weeks later, I received another surprise. A former employee from one of my father's businesses contacted me. His name was Tom Reyes. We met at a diner outside Norfolk. Tom brought a worn folder containing documents he'd legally retained after the company closed. Most were ordinary, but one file referenced personal guarantees attached to commercial loans. My father's signature appeared repeatedly. Several references pointed back to properties now owned by Richard. I thanked Tom and drove home with the folder sitting beside me. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt something shifting. Not victory. Clarity? Nah. The strange thing about revenge is that most people imagine it as an emotional experience. Rage, confrontation, humiliation. The reality can be much quieter. Sometimes revenge is simply standing still while someone races toward a cliff. You don't push them. You don't trip them. You simply decline to stop them. By late autumn, Richard's confidence seemed to be growing. So did his spending. I heard he'd hired contractors, ordered renovations, started discussing future investments. The man was behaving like someone who had inherited millions. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. One evening, I sat alone on my back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The stack of documents rested beside me. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The transfer agreement Richard had forced me to sign wasn't merely transferring assets. It was transferring responsibilities. Every responsibility. Completely legally. And if my understanding was correct, Richard had accepted obligations far larger than he realized. I thought about calling him, warning him, explaining what I'd found. Instead, I folded the papers and carried them back inside. For most of our lives, Richard had believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Perhaps it was finally time for him to meet his own. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling that meeting was coming sooner than either of us expected. The first creditor arrived 3 months later. I didn't witness it myself. I heard about it through one of our mutual friends. Richard had apparently been hosting a small gathering at the lake house. Nothing extravagant, just a few friends, some neighbors, and a contractor discussing renovation plans. In the middle of the afternoon, a representative from a financial institution showed up, requesting documentation regarding one of the properties. According to the story, Richard brushed him off, told him there had to be some mistake. The representative remained polite, left a business card, and drove away. Richard laughed about it afterward. At least that's what I was told. At the time, he still believed he was the smartest man in the room. A week later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Richard. I only learned about it because my cousin Linda called. Family news travels fast, especially bad family news. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "have you talked to Richard lately?" "No. Something seems wrong." I didn't ask what she meant, partly because I already knew, partly because I wanted to hear her explanation. Linda lowered her voice. "He says creditors keep contacting him." I looked out my kitchen window. Leaves were beginning to fall from the trees. Autumn had settled over Virginia. What kind of creditors? He didn't say. Of course, he didn't. People rarely discuss financial trouble until they're drowning in it. By November, the situation appeared to be escalating. Property notices, tax inquiries, loan servicing communications, requests for documentation. Most were routine. The problem wasn't any single letter. The problem was volume. One letter can be ignored. 20 letters become difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, I continued living my ordinary life. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I volunteered at a veterans center near Richmond. I helped organize records, coordinate appointments, and occasionally assist older veterans with paperwork. The work grounded me. Many of the men and women who visited had faced challenges far greater than inheritance, disputes, combat injuries, widowhood, illness, loneliness. Compared to those struggles, family greed seemed almost small. Almost. One afternoon, a retired Marine named Frank noticed I seemed distracted. Frank was 82 years old, the type of man who could spot trouble from 100 yards away. "Something bothering you, Commander?" I smiled. Most veterans never stop using military titles. "Family issue?" He nodded knowingly. "The worst kind?" That made me laugh. "Why is that?" "Because you can't request a transfer." As winter approached, reports about Richard became increasingly concerning. The renovations at the lake house suddenly stopped. Contractors weren't returning. Several planned purchases disappeared. The luxury SUV remained, but many of the grand plans quietly vanished. I suspected reality was beginning to arrive. Reality rarely knocks. It simply walks in and sits down. Then came the phone call. The first one from Richard since our argument months earlier. It happened on a cold December evening. I was reading a book when my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. For several seconds, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." There was a long silence, then his voice, "Evelyn." He sounded different, less confident, less polished, older somehow. What's going on? I asked another pause. I have a question. I waited. Did Dad ever mention business loans to you? The question almost made me smile. Almost. Years ago. What did he say? Not much. Silence again. Then nothing. The call ended less than a minute later, but it told me everything I needed to know. The house of cards had begun to shake. Over the next several weeks, I received occasional updates through friends and relatives. Richard was meeting with accountants. Richard was consulting attorneys. Richard was requesting financial records. Richard was becoming increasingly frustrated. One story in particular stood out. Apparently, he'd confronted Stephen Granger, the attorney who handled the estate paperwork. The conversation had not gone well. Richard demanded explanations. Stephen insisted the documents were valid. Richard accused him of negligence. Stephen reportedly replied with a sentence that would later become important. You signed exactly what you wanted signed. That sentence haunted Richard because it was true. Around Christmas, I visited my mother's grave. It was something I did every year. The cemetery sat on a quiet hillside overlooking part of Norfolk. Cold wind moved through the bare trees. I stood there holding a small arrangement of winter flowers. For a while, I simply talked, not out loud, just internally, the way people often speak to loved ones who are gone. I found myself thinking about my parents, their marriage, their mistakes, their strengths, their failures. For the first time, I wondered whether my father had fully understood the mess he was leaving behind. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he didn't. The dead rarely answer questions. January brought new developments. Public records revealed additional obligations attached to several properties. Nothing illegal, nothing fraudulent, just expensive. Very expensive. The kind of obligations that transform an apparent fortune into a burden. One afternoon, I spread everything across my dining room table once again. Loan references, property filings, guarantees, tax obligations, trust provisions, transfer agreements. I reviewed them carefully. By now, the pattern was obvious. Richard had inherited every asset and every responsibility attached to those assets. The two were inseparable. The agreement made that crystal clear. The irony wasn't lost on me. If Richard had divided the inheritance fairly, both of us might have shared the burden. Instead, greed had concentrated everything in one place. The benefits, the risks, the obligations, all of it. He had wanted the entire pie. Now he owned the entire bakery, including its debts. By February, rumors were spreading throughout Norfolk. People who once praised Richard's business instincts had become quieter. The admiration was fading. Questions, clear's throat, were replacing compliments. Nobody likes discussing financial trouble publicly, especially people who spent years bragging about success. Then, another surprise arrived. A certified letter. This one addressed to me. Inside was a formal notice regarding the final probate hearing. The remaining estate matters would soon be resolved in court. Attendance was required. I read the notice twice, then a third time. The hearing date was 6 weeks away. That evening, I called my attorney. Unlike Richard, I had eventually hired one, not for revenge, for protection. His name was Michael Harris, a practical man with decades of experience. After reviewing the hearing notice, he asked a simple question. Are you prepared? I looked at the folders stacked neatly beside my desk. Every document, every record, every piece of evidence. Yes, you sound very certain. I am. Michael chuckled softly. I've noticed something about you, Evelyn. What's that? You never sound this calm unless you're holding stronger cards than everyone else. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The hearing was approaching. The moment Richard had been working toward for nearly a year. The moment he believed would permanently secure his victory. The strange part was that I no longer felt angry. Disappointed. Yes, hurt, certainly. But anger had faded. In its place was something simpler. Acceptance. The facts were the facts. The documents were the documents. Soon, everyone would see them, and when they did, Richard would finally discover that winning and benefiting are not always the same thing. The final hearing was 6 weeks away, and for the first time since my father died, I believed the truth was about to catch up with all of us. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Virginia winters have a way of making everything feel quieter. The roads, the trees, even people. I left my townhouse before sunrise and drove toward Norfolk with a thermos of coffee sitting beside me. The courthouse was familiar. Not because I spent time in courtrooms, but because government buildings tend to look remarkably similar. Plain, practical, unimpressed by human drama. As I parked my car, I sat for a moment staring through the windshield. Nearly a year had passed since my father's death. A year of paperwork, a year of discoveries, a year of watching assumptions slowly collide with reality. And now everything was about to come together. Inside the courthouse, attorneys moved through hallways carrying files. Families sat on benches. Clerks hurried between offices. Life went on. No one seemed particularly interested in the Carter family dispute, which was oddly comforting to us. It felt enormous. To the world, it was simply another case. I found my attorney, Michael Harris, near the courtroom entrance. He greeted me with a nod. "You sleep last night?" "A little," he smiled. "That's more than most people get before hearings." I looked toward the closed courtroom doors. "How do you think this goes?" Michael adjusted his glasses. "The same way facts usually go." That was one reason I liked him. He wasn't dramatic. A few minutes later, Richard arrived. I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence he'd worn for months was cracked. Still present, but cracked. He looked tired. His suit was expensive. His expression wasn't. Stephen Granger, his attorney, walked beside him, carrying several folders. Neither man appeared happy. For a brief moment, Richard and I stood facing each other in the hallway. No audience, no judge, no lawyers speaking for us, just two siblings. The same siblings who used to ride bicycles through Norfolk neighborhoods 50 years earlier. The same siblings who once shared a backyard swing set. The same siblings who somehow ended up here. Richard broke the silence first. "You could have warned me." The statement surprised me. I stared at him. "Warned you about what?" His jaw tightened. "You know exactly what." I shook my head. "No, Richard, I really don't." Because the truth was simple. I hadn't created his problem. I had discovered it. There is a difference. A very important difference. The courtroom filled gradually. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the hearing began. At first, the proceedings felt routine. Procedural matters, estate summaries, legal clarifications, references to documents already filed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. The kind of process that would probably bore most people. But beneath the surface, tension was building. I could feel it. So could Richard. About an hour into the hearing, discussion turned toward the final transfer agreements. The documents Richard had relied upon for nearly a year. The same documents I had signed while grieving. The same documents that had transferred nearly everything to him. Stephen Granger presented his position confidently. Ownership had been transferred. The agreements were valid. The estate distribution was complete. Simple, clean, final. At least that was the argument. "Oh." Then the judge asked whether there were any remaining concerns. Michael stood. "There are, Your Honor." The room became slightly quieter. Michael approached the bench calmly, methodically, the way experienced attorneys often do. No theatrics, no grand speeches, just facts. He began discussing the trust language, then the transfer provisions, then the obligations attached to transferred assets. Several people started reviewing documents, including the judge, including Stephen Granger, including Richard Bitt. I watched Richard's face carefully. At first, he seemed confused, then irritated, then concerned. The progression happened slowly, like storm clouds gathering. Michael directed everyone's attention toward a specific section, the same section I had discovered months earlier at my dining room table. The same paragraph nobody seemed to have examined closely, or perhaps nobody had understood. The language was straightforward. Any beneficiary receiving transferred assets also assumed all associated obligations, liabilities, guarantees, encumbrances, and financial responsibilities. Not some, all ta. The judge adjusted his glasses and reread the provision, then reread it again. Stephen Granger leaned forward. His expression changed. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared. Richard looked toward his attorney. "What does that mean?" Stephen didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Additional documents followed. Property records, loan records, guarantee agreements, public filings, financial obligations linked directly to assets Richard now owned. One by one, methodically, relentlessly, not accusations, evidence. Thus, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted. People began understanding the situation. The inheritance wasn't simply property. It was a package. Assets and obligations, benefits and burdens. You couldn't separate one from the other. The documents made that clear. Then came the moment I still remember most vividly. The moment that started this story. Richard leaned back in his chair, trying to recover control, trying to project confidence, trying to convince himself the situation wasn't slipping away. He looked directly at me. "Enjoy retirement." Several heads turned. Then he delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed without a house. I smiled. Not because I enjoyed seeing him suffer, because for the first time all year, we were finally discussing reality. "But you forgot one thing." The room became still. Stephen Granger looked up immediately. "What did you just say?" I met his eyes. "You never finished reading the agreement." Subs for several seconds. Nobody spoke. The silence felt enormous. Then the judge began asking questions. Detailed questions. Specific questions. Questions about obligations. Questions about liability transfers. Questions about trust provisions. Questions that became increasingly difficult for Richard's side to answer because the answers were sitting in black and white print. Eventually the picture became unavoidable. The agreement Richard had forced me to sign had transferred ownership completely, legally, irrevocably. But ownership wasn't the only thing transferred. Responsibility had transferred too. Every obligation attached to every asset now belonged to the person who owned those assets. Richard. I watched the realization spread across his face. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no collapse, just understanding. A slow, painful understanding, the kind that arrives when denial finally runs out of places to hide. The judge reviewed the documents one final time, then issued his ruling. The transfer agreements remained valid. The ownership transfers remained valid. The associated obligations remained valid. Everything stood exactly as written. Richard owned the estate. All of it. The family house, the lake property, the investment assets, the business interests, every piece and every responsibility connected to those pieces. The hearing ended less than 30 minutes later. People gathered their papers. Attorneys packed their briefcases. Observers quietly exited. Life moved forward as it always does. I remained seated for a moment, not celebrating, not triumphant, just absorbing the finality of it. For months, everyone had assumed I was the victim. Maybe I was at first, but somewhere along the way, facts replaced assumptions. And facts have a remarkable way of defending themselves. As I stood to leave, I glanced across the courtroom. Richard remained in his chair, motionless, staring at the document spread before him. For the first time in nearly a year, he wasn't looking at an inheritance. He was looking at the truth. And the truth was far heavier than the fortune he thought he'd won. People imagine that revenge ends with a dramatic victory, a courtroom ruling, a shocking revelation, a defeated enemy, then the credits roll. Real life isn't like that. Real life keeps going. Bills still arrive. People still wake up in the morning. And consequences continue unfolding long after everyone else has stopped paying attention. That was exactly what happened after the hearing. The first few weeks were strangely quiet. I returned to Richmond, resumed volunteering at the Veterans Center, worked in my garden, went grocery shopping, paid my utility bills. Life felt almost ordinary again. Meanwhile, Richard was beginning a very different chapter. The obligations tied to the estate didn't disappear because the hearing ended. If anything, they became more real. Loan restructuring discussions intensified. Property evaluations were ordered. Financial reviews expanded. Creditors wanted answers. Banks wanted documentation. Tax authorities wanted compliance. Nobody cared about family drama. They cared about numbers. For months, Richard had viewed the estate as a prize. Now he was learning that ownership carries responsibilities, sometimes enormous responsibilities. And unlike family arguments, financial obligations don't respond to excuses. Around April, I heard the lake property had been listed for sale. The news came through a former neighbor. I wasn't surprised. The maintenance costs alone were significant. Adding the debt obligations made the situation even harder. The property had been in our family for decades. I remembered fishing there with my father when I was 10 years old. I remembered my mother sitting on the dock reading novels. I remembered summer cookouts, birthday parties, family photographs. Soon it would belong to strangers. The thought saddened me more than I expected. Not because I wanted the property, because it represented a chapter of life that was ending forever. A few weeks later, another piece of news arrived. The family house was being sold too. That one hit even harder. The old Carter house had been standing for over 50 years. Every important memory seemed connected to it. Christmas mornings, school graduations, arguments, celebrations, ordinary dinners, everything. Now it was becoming another listing on a real estate website. One evening, I found myself driving through Norfolk. I hadn't planned it. Sometimes memories simply pull you somewhere. The house stood exactly where it always had. A for sale sign sat near the sidewalk. I parked across the street. For nearly 20 minutes, I just sat there looking, remembering, grieving, not for the building, for time. Time is the one thing nobody inherits, nobody keeps, nobody gets back. By early summer, Richard's social circle seemed to be shrinking. That wasn't unusual. Success attracts people. Struggle reveals them. Many of the friends who celebrated his inheritance weren't around anymore. The invitations slowed. The phone calls became less frequent. The admiration disappeared. Life can be brutally honest that way. Then came another surprise. One afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it. Richard stood there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The last time we'd seen each other was at the hearing. 3 months earlier, he looked older. Not dramatically older, just worn down, like someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. Of course. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had discovered the clause that changed everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. For several minutes, Richard stared at his coffee cup, searching for words. Eventually, he found them. "Did you know?" I already understood the question. Know what? That the estate was carrying all those obligations? I thought carefully before answering. Honesty mattered, especially now. "No." He looked up. I continued. "Not when I signed." That answer seemed to surprise him. Maybe he expected a different response, a triumphant one, a cruel one. Instead, he got the truth. "I thought you planned all of it." I shook my head. "I discovered it afterward." The room became quiet. A clock ticked softly in the background. Outside, birds moved through the trees. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Richard rubbed his face. "You know what's funny?" "What's that?" "I spent years believing Dad trusted me more." The statement hung in the air. Painfully honest, painfully familiar. Neither of us had talked openly about our childhood in decades. Now the memories began surfacing slowly, carefully, like old photographs being removed from storage. Richard laughed bitterly. Every conversation felt like a competition. I nodded because he was right. Our father compared everything. Grades, jobs, achievements, choices. It wasn't always intentional, but it happened constantly. Children notice those things, even when adults think they don't. "I thought if I won enough," Richard said quietly, "eventually I'd feel like I mattered." The word struck me harder than I expected, because beneath the greed, beneath the deception, beneath the inheritance fight, there was a wounded little boy. The same little boy who spent years trying to earn approval. The same thing I had done. We simply chose different methods. For the first time, I stopped seeing Richard as the man who tricked me. I started seeing him as someone who had spent decades trapped inside the same family story. A different role, the same story. That didn't excuse what he did. Not even close. Understanding isn't the same as forgiveness. And forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. But understanding changes the shape of anger. It softens some of its edges. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about lawsuits, not about money, not about court rulings, about our mother, about old vacations, about mistakes, about growing older, about the strange realization that our lives were now closer to the end than the beginning. People over 60 understand that feeling. Time starts looking different, more valuable, more fragile, more honest. So before leaving, Richard stood near the door. There was something he wanted to say. I could see it. Finally, he managed it. I was wrong. Simple words. Hard words. The kind most people wait too long to say. I nodded. I know. Wine ended. After he left, I sat alone for a long time, watching sunlight move across the kitchen floor, thinking, reflecting. The revenge I once thought I wanted no longer seemed important. The court case was over. The estate was disappearing. The money was fading. The properties were being sold. In the end, none of it had brought happiness to anyone. Not my father, not Richard, not me. What remained was something far more complicated. 2 aging siblings, a lifetime of misunderstandings, and perhaps for the very first time, a chance to stop competing. The strange thing was that after everything that happened, that possibility felt more valuable than any inheritance ever could. A year after the final hearing, very little remained of the Carter estate. The lake property had been sold. The family house belonged to another family. Most of the investment assets had been liquidated. The complicated financial obligations that once hid beneath the surface of my father's wealth had consumed much of what people thought was a fortune. If someone had looked only at the final numbers, they probably would have called the entire story a tragedy. Maybe they would have been right, but numbers rarely tell the whole story. By then, I was 68 years old. Retirement had settled into something comfortable. Not exciting, not glamorous, just peaceful. And after everything that had happened, peaceful felt like a gift. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I still volunteered at the Veteran Center. The work gave structure to my days. Some mornings, I helped veterans fill out forms. Other days, I simply listened. People carry heavy things as they age, not always physically. Sometimes emotionally, regret, loss, loneliness, memories. Many just need someone willing to sit quietly beside them. One afternoon, a Korean War veteran named Harold shared something that stayed with me. We were organizing records when he suddenly said, "You know, when you're young, you think life is about collecting things." I smiled. "What changed?" He shrugged. "Eventually, you realize life is mostly about letting things go." At the time, I simply nodded. Later, driving home, I realized how perfectly those words described my own journey. The inheritance, the anger, the competition, the need to prove something. One by one, I had begun letting them go. Richard and I weren't suddenly best friends. Life doesn't work that way. Television likes dramatic reconciliations. Real life usually offers something quieter, something more believable. We spoke occasionally, had lunch once every month or two, exchanged phone calls, nothing extraordinary. But the hostility was gone, and that alone felt remarkable. One Saturday afternoon in early autumn, Richard called unexpectedly. "I found something," he said. "What kind of something?" "I think you should see it." A few hours later, he arrived carrying a small wooden box. The box looked old, handmade, the sort of thing people kept on closet shelves for decades. Without saying much, he placed it on my dining room table, the same table that seemed connected to every major turning point in this story. Then he opened the lid. Damn. Inside were photographs, letters, military documents, birthday cards, family keepsakes, the kinds of items that somehow survive long after money disappears. For a moment, neither of us touched anything. We simply looked. Then I noticed a photograph. My mother was standing beside me at my Navy commissioning ceremony. I couldn't have been more than 22. Her smile filled the picture. I'd forgotten that photograph existed. Carefully, I picked it up. Richard found another. The four of us standing at the lake property. Dad looked younger. Mom looked happy. Richard and I looked sunburned. We both laughed. The first genuine laugh we'd shared in years. For hours, we sorted through the contents. Each item unlocked another memory. A Christmas card written in my mother's handwriting. A report card from elementary school. Old vacation pictures. Letters I had mailed home during deployments overseas. Even a few notes written by my father. That surprised me. Walter Carter wasn't a man known for writing down his feelings. Eventually, I unfolded one of the notes. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. Most of it concerned ordinary family matters. But one line stopped me cold. Take care of each other when I'm gone. I read it twice, then handed it to Richard. He read it silently. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Two people who had spent nearly a year fighting over an inheritance. Two people who had nearly destroyed their relationship and buried inside a forgotten box was a simple request. Take care of each other. H. The sun began setting outside. Golden lights spilled across the room. Neither of us seemed eager to leave, so we carried the box onto the back porch. There we continued, sorting through memories while evening slowly settled around us. At one point, Richard held up a photograph of our father. He stared at it for a long time, then quietly said, "I spent most of my life trying to impress him. I looked out across the yard. So did I. The difference was that neither of us needed to do it anymore. That chapter had ended. The competition was over. Not because one of us won, because there was finally nothing left to win. The inheritance was gone, the properties were gone, the money was mostly gone. But strangely enough, losing those things revealed something important. They had never been the real issue. The real issue had been the weight we carried for decades. Old comparisons, old resentments, old wounds. The estate dispute merely exposed them. Well, as darkness settled across the yard, we packed the photographs back into the wooden box. Not carefully, not ceremonially, just naturally. Like two siblings finishing an afternoon together. Before leaving, Richard paused at the porch steps. "Keep the box," he said. "You sure?" He nodded. "I think Mom would have wanted you to have it." After he left, I remained outside for a while. The night air was cool. A few stars appeared overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The neighborhood was quiet, peacefully ordinary. I thought about my father, my mother, the court hearing, the documents, the inheritance, everything that had happened. And I realized something. The most valuable thing I received from my family's estate wasn't listed in any will. It wasn't protected by any trust. And it certainly wasn't awarded in any courtroom. It was perspective. The understanding that some burdens aren't worth carrying forever, and some victories aren't worth winning. If you've stayed with me through this story, perhaps you've experienced something similar in your own life. Maybe it involved family, maybe friendship, maybe a misunderstanding that lasted far longer than it should have. If so, I hope this story leaves you with one gentle thought. Sometimes peace arrives not when we finally defeat someone, but when we finally stop fighting battles that no longer need to be fought. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen a family torn apart by money, pride, or old wounds? And if you found your way back to peace, perhaps your story might help someone else. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself. Take care of the people who matter. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome to join us.